Some secrets are buried not because they're dangerous, but because the heart isn't ready to face them. But imagine this. A forgotten painting, buried beneath dust and silence, suddenly resurfaces. Could you bear to face the truth it holds? The story you're about to hear isn't just about a missing woman, a slashed portrait, or a long-abandoned investigation. It's about the chilling emotions that creep quietly through generations, until one day, a door to the past creaks open, and what steps out isn't just memory, it's justice. Charlotte Devane arrived at the somber, ivy-strangled gates of the Devane estate, not with the poise of a triumphant heiress, but with the silent caution of someone stepping into a story that was never meant to be hers. There was no celebration, no welcoming committee, only the slow creak of rusted hinges, and the low whisper of wind that sounded almost like a warning. The manor, a monolithic shadow, seated at the far edge of East Graven's mist-covered moor, had stood lifeless since the strange, unspoken death of Admiral Thaddeus Devane the autumn before. A man as feared in the Navy as he was unknown within his own family. Its windows stared blankly into the fog like watching eyes too tired to blink, and the brambles had grown wild, clawing at the stone walls as though trying to reclaim what had been taken. Charlotte knew the Admiral only from a handful of terse holiday letters, and a single disquieting memory, a visit when she was just 7, during which he'd said nothing but stared at her for what felt like hours. The inheritance came without a solicitor's call, or any formal explanation, just a yellowed envelope tucked into her mailbox, bearing no return address, only her name and the phrase "return to where it began." Inside a deed, a key, and a torn scrap of parchment that simply read, "Not all that is buried stays asleep." What was meant to be a brief inspection for resale turned into something stranger, heavier. The house seemed to breathe in silence, its walls absorbing her footsteps like secrets it refused to echo. Though structurally sound, it felt hollowed, as though something essential had been scooped out and hidden away. The grand halls were preserved in immaculate rigidity, books arranged by size, not subject, clocks all ticking, but none in sync, mirrors covered, not from superstition, but perhaps shame. Each room she entered seemed to resist her presence, as if waiting for someone else, someone it remembered. Her unease grew as she wandered, drawn not by logic but by instinct, drawn to the places that felt most forgotten. And then came the incident during the renovation. She'd hired a small crew from Morrow's Hollow to assess structural damage on the upper levels, but it was while removing a decayed bookcase on the north corridor that something unexpected happened. One of the workers knocked hollow against the wall and called out, not in fear but with a nervous chuckle. Behind the bookcase, flush with the wood paneling, was a narrow hidden door painted the same faded color as the surrounding wall, so seamless, so still, it might have remained undiscovered for another century. The door had no keyhole, just a cold, tarnished knob and the kind of stillness that settles around places not meant to be disturbed. Charlotte, breath shallow, opened it herself. The air that rushed out smelled of old turpentine, forgotten seasons, and something else, darker. The staircase behind it spiraled upward, unnaturally narrow, its boards groaning with every tentative step. She climbed, lantern in hand, heart pounding louder than her feet. At the top she found a single door, unlatched, yawning open as if expecting her. Inside was a hidden studio, preserved in eerie silence, canvases stacked against walls like coffins, paintbrushes left mid-stroke, palettes frozen in time. Sunlight pushed weakly through gauzy curtains, illuminating dust that floated like ash. It felt less like a room and more like a moment abandoned. And there, standing on the far end of the room, was an easel, and upon it, a painting. Not just a painting, a presence. The woman, captured in oil, looked not posed but caught, her expression flickering between sorrow and secrecy. Her eyes, a deep liquid black, looked away, not from modesty, but as though staring into something she dared not face. Her features were striking, strong cheekbones, lips parted as if a breath had been stolen mid-thought, and a silver locket around her throat that shimmered with impossible familiarity. Charlotte felt a chill, not of cold, but of recognition. The portrait had no name, no date, no artist's mark, only a faint smear of something red, almost hidden beneath the frame. It wasn't paint. It looked coagulated, alarmed but captivated. Charlotte summoned Mrs. Harrow, the long-time house steward. The woman paused in the doorway, as if she'd stepped into a memory she didn't want to relive. "Miss," she whispered, voice cracking like old timber, "this room shouldn't be here." It was sealed. After the fire. After her. Her gaze drifted to the painting, but refused to settle. They said she vanished, but no one ever spoke of what he painted last. Some doors, Miss Devane, they're not forgotten because of time. They're forgotten because something inside demanded it. Her voice trailed into silence as the temperature in the room seemed to fall. Outside, the wind howled louder through the trees, as if the house had finally awakened. Like someone who feared disturbing sediment long settled, Evelyn Harrow began her inquiries, not with urgency, but with the gentle discretion of someone conscious that truth, once unearthed, rarely returns to sleep. She spoke in soft tones with the estate's groundskeeper, the distant-eyed librarian, who once catalogued the Harrow family archives, even the apothecary's wife who'd lived in the village longer than the hedgerows. But what she received in return was not ignorance, nor indifference. It was evasion, carefully masked in polite smiles and hushed murmurs. Perhaps she was a governess, one suggested, or a visitor from the continent, another whispered, eyes flicking sideways, as though worried someone might hear the memory stirring. Evelyn soon understood. They hadn't forgotten. They refused to remember. Word of her discovery, the portrait hidden behind a false panel in the east wing of Harrowgate Hall, reached the ears of Mrs. Langley during her weekly visit to the seamstress. By the time it reached Miss Celestine Fairfax, the retired headmistress and de facto keeper of village truths, it was cloaked in uncertainty and dread. A sealed room, and a woman's likeness no one recalls. Celestine muttered into her teacup, her fingers going still mid-stitch. Her eyes, dulled by age, but not softened, flickered with a knowledge that had yet to be voiced. For Evelyn, the portrait had become more than an inheritance curiosity. It was a question. The woman in the painting was neither labeled nor logged, not in the estate's books, not in the family letters, not even in the sketches from the old artist's journals. She later uncovered in the attic, most of which were mundane, save for one entry abruptly torn out. And yet the painting bore a presence too distinct to have been imagined. A woman with sorrow sculpted into her expression, her back turned but face captured in profile, as though she'd been caught mid-flight from something unspeakable. The brushstrokes were vivid, the background hazy, and her eyes, those eyes seemed to plead with the viewer for silence, not remembrance. Evelyn sought out those who had known her great-uncle the best. Mrs. Quinn, the cook who once prepared his meals with military punctuality. Mr. Beale, the man who maintained the bell tower and often smoked outside the hall. Even little Nora Fenwick, now grown, who remembered delivering parcels there as a girl, and being told never to look toward the third-floor windows. Each offered vague sentiments. None denied the portrait's existence. Yet none claimed to recall the woman it portrayed. At the butcher's, Evelyn overheard two elderly women speaking in lowered tones. "Not her again," one hissed. "Let it lie. That room should have stayed sealed." It was that phrase again that pierced Evelyn's thoughts like a splinter. And later, when she returned to the manor, beneath the ticking of the mismatched clocks and the hollow hush of sealed-off corridors, she found slipped beneath her door a scrap of parchment bearing no name. Just a message, written in ink that bled at the edges. Do not uncover what was meant to be erased. And still the portrait remained, now resting on the study mantel, veiled by a sheet Evelyn could not bring herself to remove again. The villagers' reluctance was not rooted in forgetfulness, she realized, but in a collective pact of silence. It was not the unknown they feared, but the remembered. And somewhere, deep in the walls of Harrowgate Hall, Evelyn felt something stirring, not ghost perhaps, but guilt made manifest. Miss Fairfax, having heard of the note through her quiet channels, did not speak of it aloud. But as she threaded her needle beneath the flickering gaslight that evening, she glanced once at her own wall of forgotten letters, and whispered, "Some portraits are painted with more than pigment, and some secrets frame themselves." The visitors arrived just after noon, 3 women whose histories were woven deep into the soil of Windmere Hollow, summoned not by invitation but by the delicate gravity of gossip and curiosity. Eloise Trenwith, the rector's widow, brought with her the sort of polished detachment honed by decades of observing other people's lives from behind lace curtains. Beside her was Miss Agatha Holling, retired schoolmistress and self-appointed guardian of village memory, whose spectacles glinted like tiny judgments. The third, Maeve Calder, youngest of the trio, and quietest, wore the reserved expression of someone who had seen something once, perhaps long ago, and never spoken of it again. Amelia Forsyth, newly arrived heir to the Greystone estate, had arranged the tea in hopes of conversation but found herself navigating a fog of polite misdirection. The topic of the portrait, an oil painting uncovered behind a false wall in her inherited study, emerged like steam from a kettle, slowly then suddenly everywhere. Eloise opined that the woman in the frame was likely a long-lost family member, though she offered no name or date, only the suggestion of continental features. Agatha recalled a governess who vanished just before the war, her tone neutral but eyes too still. Maeve, sipping her tea too slowly, spoke just once in a voice so low, Amelia leaned forward to hear. "Some paintings," she murmured, "aren't meant to be found again." The silence that followed was sharp-edged. As they left, cake barely touched and chairs left at soft, careful angles, Amelia sensed that she had not gained answers but opened a door into something deeper. That night, she returned to the study, drawn again to the portrait's dark, unsettling eyes. It was then she noticed faint scratches along the wooden frame, like fingernails dragged in resistance. The following day, Miss Althea Marwick, known in the village for her herb tonics and sharper instincts, visited under the guise of returning a borrowed teacup. Her gaze fell instantly upon the newly hung painting, and though she said nothing, her pupils contracted. She later confided to her sister that the woman in the portrait bore a troubling resemblance to a girl once whispered about, a maid who vanished after a summer storm left the manor flooded, and the cellars locked for weeks. "But that's nonsense," she added, more to herself than to her listener. "No one remembers her name." Yet memory, Amelia was learning, was not always absent. Sometimes it was hiding. A few days later, while walking past the garden wall near dusk, she found a rusted key tucked inside the hollow of an old stone. It was wrapped in yellowed linen, the kind used to bind wounds or secrets. That night, unable to resist the pull of the unseen, Amelia descended to the lower floors of the manor, where the plaster had begun to crumble and cold draughts whispered stories through floorboards. Behind a panel near the wine cellar, she discovered a room not listed in the plans, dust-filled, airless, and at its center, a second portrait, this one unfinished, the face smeared, as though someone had tried to erase it, and in the far corner, a single shoe, small leather, and unmistakably antique, rested beneath a shattered mirror. When she brought it to the village historian the next morning, the color drained from his face. "I thought that room was sealed," he said, voice barely audible. "I thought we'd moved on." Amelia did not reply. She understood now that some histories were not forgotten, they were buried, and someone, perhaps many, had worked hard to keep them that way. Upstairs, the original painting remained undisturbed, yet somehow heavier on the wall, as though it knew it had been seen. It arrived not with a knock, but with the soft, deliberate scrape of paper sliding beneath the door, an envelope, unmarked and yellowed with time, slipping silently across the polished wood of Eleanor Wexley's study floor, while she was engrossed in conversation with a local archivist, one whose name had long since faded from memory in the dusty corners of Langford's record books. They were discussing an incident, buried deep and carefully redacted from the town's official history, an event that had been long forgotten, even by those who still lived in the town. Eleanor had been cataloguing a collection of obscure family records, each more mysterious than the last, when she discovered the note. It was folded with a precision that suggested not haste but deliberate care, the edges sharp, untouched by time. The ink was an unsettling violet-black, faintly smudged at the corners, as if it had been written with a fountain pen of an older era, one that spoke more of secrecy than of artistry. It bore no signature, no name, no marks of any kind, but the message, simple yet chilling, was unmistakable. Do not display the painting. Some truths, once unburied, do not return quietly. Eleanor, ever the skeptic, felt a strange tightness in her chest as she read it. Her first instinct was to dismiss the note, but a coldness, like the creeping touch of a shadow across her throat, stopped her. The rediscovered portrait, the one that had been tucked away in the manor's forgotten cellar for decades, had been until that very moment an odd curiosity, a relic of the past, something to marvel at, but not something to fear. It was a portrait of a woman, her face turned away, her features distorted as though the artist had abandoned it mid-stroke. The colors, dull and faded, seemed to suggest a story, one half told, one left incomplete. But now Eleanor wondered if there was more to this canvas than she had first realized. The feeling of dread, the palpable weight of the warning in the note, made her wonder whether her discovery had been more than mere chance. Could it be that the painting, rather than being an innocent relic, was a catalyst? One that could awaken something long buried, something too dangerous to confront. The next morning, Eleanor, still unsettled, sought counsel from Delphine Arkwright, a woman whose sharp mind was tempered by the gentleness of her age. Delphine, who had known the Wexley family for years, was well versed in the town's whispered histories, in its secrets, its half-truths. When Eleanor showed her the note, Delphine's eyes softened as she turned it over in her hands. "There's a finality in this message," she said, her voice carrying a weight that spoke of long-held knowledge. "It's not a warning to be taken lightly. This is a request from the past, a request not to disturb what has been buried. And once something is buried, it's rarely left untouched without consequence." Delphine's words lingered in the air, like the faintest perfume, and Eleanor felt the presence of a memory stir within her, something she had read once in a diary hidden behind the false panel of the manor's library. The silencing. It was a scandal from 1914, one that had nearly ruined the Wexley name. It involved a young governess, a child who had vanished without a trace, and a series of unsettling sketches that had been submitted to the local paper in the months before the disappearance. The final sketch, a half-finished portrait of a crying woman clutching a key, had been the last anyone had seen of the governess. Afterward, the sketches stopped. The key, Eleanor now realized, was hidden behind the frame of the rediscovered portrait. The coincidence was far too perfect. It could not have been a mere chance. As the days passed, the mystery deepened. Eleanor began to hear rumors, whispers of a man named Casimir Doyle, a conservator who claimed to have studied under Julian Morant, an artist whose career had been swallowed by the ravages of war. Morant's disappearance had been shrouded in secrecy. Some said he had faked his own death to escape scandal. Others whispered that he had been murdered for his knowledge of a great artistic secret. Doyle had arrived in Langford under the pretext of providing consultation on the newly discovered portrait, claiming that the style of brushwork, specifically the way the light hit the collarbone, and the soft stippling at the edges of the locket, was unmistakably from Morant's final phase, a time when his work had taken on a darker, more somber tone. But Doyle, with his sharp gaze and air of quiet certainty, went further than a simple observation. He suggested that the portrait was not merely a piece of art. It was in fact a confession, a truth wrapped in paint, a story too dangerous to remain unspoken. "If this is truly his work," he murmured, his voice low and measured, "then it is not simply a portrait. It is the key to something much darker. And once the key is turned, there is no going back." Word of this discovery spread like wildfire, each retelling adding layers of speculation and intrigue. By the following afternoon, several villagers had decided that the woman in the painting must have been Morant's lover, his muse, or perhaps even the one who had driven him to madness. Some went as far as to claim that she was the one who had murdered him in a fit of jealousy, her face now forever immortalized in the unfinished portrait. These tales, though unsupported by any solid evidence, were embraced eagerly by those in search of an explanation that made sense of their quiet, insular lives. Eleanor, however, was not convinced. She felt the weight of the portrait's gaze on her as if it were alive, watching, waiting for the moment when its truth would be forced into the light. One evening, as she stood before the painting in the dim light of the manor's attic, she heard footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from behind her. When she turned, there was no one there, only the portrait, its eyes clearer now than ever before, staring back at her, as though it knew she was on the verge of something far greater than anyone could comprehend. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that the painting was not merely a piece of art, it was a mirror that reflected not the past, but the present, and the truth it held was one that once seen, could never be unseen. Miss Marple stood quietly in the post office, her gaze drifting through the flurry of whispered conversations that buzzed like insects trapped within the walls. Her attention, however, wasn't caught by the passing of mundane gossip or idle chatter about the latest town events. No, it was the subtle shift in the air that intrigued her, the undercurrent of unease that had begun to worm its way into Langford, especially since Mr. Carter had so casually mentioned the portrait. It wasn't just the painting itself that had people talking. No, it was the idea that something long hidden might suddenly be remembered, and with that, a name, a presence, that was never supposed to surface again. The town's history, polished and pristine as it seemed, was far more fragile than it appeared, and Miss Marple sensed it. The connection to Dorianville and, more pointedly, to the war years, had brought forth the murky shadow of discomfort. Langford's seemingly flawless record of patriotic service was suddenly not as untarnished as they liked to believe. Colonel Archibald Langford, the heroic figure whose war accolades filled every corner of the town's records, had a curious gap in his story. His military career was marked with the typical reverence, his medals, his uniform in the attic, his legacy recited at every Remembrance Day. Yet there were months during the war unaccounted for, a strange absence lodged somewhere between France and Falmouth. It was the kind of thing that at the time, no one questioned too deeply. Wartime was not for asking difficult questions, and certainly not when the man in question was a hero. But now, in the post-war years, when memories were beginning to blur, Miss Marple felt the distance, the silence that had descended over certain conversations. And it wasn't guilt that she sensed, but something far more uncomfortable, shame. Shame that had taken root so deeply in Langford's past, that no one dared to speak of it. Conversations that might have touched upon the war years veered uncomfortably away. Mr. Partridge, the butcher, had once remarked, in passing, about some women never meant to return, before hastily changing the subject to sausages. Even the vicar, after Sunday service, had murmured something vague about spiritual wounds, only to hastily pivot to some urgent matter of church business. Miss Marple, though, had learned to listen in the pauses, in the glances that held just a little too long, in the words left unsaid. The woman in the portrait, she suspected, had never truly been forgotten. No, she had been carefully buried, her memory erased to preserve the town's dignity, her story left untold to avoid the uncomfortable truths it might unravel. The portrait was not a tribute, not a mere piece of art, but a silent accusation. It was an apology, one that the village, with all its pride and polished stories, couldn't afford to acknowledge. The strokes of paint on the canvas weren't merely romantic flourishes, they were resigned, as if the artist had known that this was the only way to capture the truth. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to Mr. Partridge's shop, a place where words were carefully measured, and the atmosphere was always just a bit more revealing than one might expect. He was not a gossip, but like many men who worked with meat, he had little tolerance for mess, whether in the butchery or in life itself. And though he was loyal to the colonel, Miss Marple knew that loyalty was often laced with distance, especially when a man's history was as tangled as Langford's. It was during a discussion about a shortage of smoked ham that Mr. Partridge, without looking up, had dropped a peculiar remark. Charlotte, who had just entered to discuss luncheon orders for the manor, had mentioned the portrait and the theory that it might have its roots in the war. Mr. Partridge, slicing through a joint of roast, had paused, his knife lingering for a moment longer than it should have. "She was never meant to return," he had muttered, as if it was a well-worn fact, a truth too painful to address. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with meaning. But Mr. Partridge had carried on as though nothing had been said, as though his words had never left his lips. Charlotte, looking unsettled, had paid, and left. But Miss Marple, ever observant, had tucked the words away like a secret in the folds of her memory. It wasn't what was said that intrigued her. It was the way it was said, unthinking, almost as if the truth had slipped out in a moment of reflex, one that he would later regret. Miss Marple observed the village of Langford with a keen eye, the weight of an invisible unease settling like a thick fog. In the days following Mr. Carter's attribution of the portrait to Dorianville, the village had shifted subtly but unmistakably. People began to speak in hushed tones, their glances flickering nervously, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of forgotten secrets. The portrait, once a mere curiosity, had now become a symbol of something much darker. It wasn't just the depiction of the mysterious woman in the painting that unsettled them. It was the implication that her identity, her very existence, could no longer be buried in the annals of the past. Carter's revelation, the village was forced to confront a truth they had long sought to forget. Someone, somewhere, knew her name, and perhaps the woman herself was not as forgotten as they had hoped. The whispers began, not from the usual gossips, but from those with more to lose. Langford's carefully constructed history was not as solid as it appeared. The connection to Dorianville, with its war-touched shadows, cast an uncomfortable pall over the town's polished reputation of patriotism. Colonel Archibald Langford, long celebrated for his service, had an unspoken gap in his narrative. His military record was impeccable, medals and accolades lining the walls of his home. But there was a period, several months, unaccounted for. It was a strange, uncomfortable silence that fell over the mention of those months, as if something about that time was not meant to be spoken of. Miss Marple recalled hearing vague references to the colonel's reassignment to a far-off outpost during the war, an odd posting for a man of his stature. At the time it seemed like just another wartime deployment, but now in the light of the portrait, Miss Marple's thoughts began to coalesce into something far more sinister. People avoided talking about those months as if the very mention of them could cause the fabric of the village's respectability to unravel. Mr. Partridge, the butcher, had been one of the few willing to touch on the subject, though it was only in the most roundabout way. When discussing the supply routes, he had muttered cryptically, "Some women were never meant to return," before abruptly changing the subject. Miss Marple had heard the words clearly, and the way he said them, matter-of-factly, as though the thought had been lodged in his mind for years, gave her pause. He had known Colonel Langford well, had served under him as a young quartermaster, and though there was no love lost between them, there was a loyalty in Mr. Partridge's manner that suggested a deeper connection, one perhaps born of shared secrets. Miss Marple made a mental note of this comment as she continued to ponder the mystery. But it was Charlotte, with her quiet persistence, who unwittingly brought the truth closer to the surface. After another quiet moment spent in the portrait room, Charlotte returned alone, driven by a strange instinct more than logic. She had taken to cleaning the space in the painting room, an act that seemed almost ritualistic in its precision. As she tidied the drawers and rearranged the scattered art supplies, the room seemed to come alive with a forgotten presence, a ghostly imprint of the artist who had once worked here with such fervor, only to vanish. It was while adjusting the easel that Charlotte's hand brushed against something hard and paper-thin. A letter, brittle with age, fluttered to the floor. No envelope, only a simple signature, Dorianville. The words inside were short but unmistakably personal. To JL, "She is my masterpiece, but they will never let her be seen." The message, cryptic yet poignant, seemed to hold the weight of a much deeper story. Charlotte, heart racing, saw the initials JL, and immediately thought of Lily Hayes, who had once absent-mindedly fumbled with a handkerchief at tea. But it was the tone of the letter that struck her most. The reverence, the quiet despair. It wasn't the tone of a jilted lover, but of an artist whose creation had been locked away, hidden from the world. She carried the letter to Miss Marple, who examined it with the meticulous care of someone accustomed to extracting truth from even the smallest of details. It wasn't just the words, but the choice of those words. "They will never let her be seen," that resonated. Who were they, and why did they have the power to keep this woman's existence hidden from the world? That night, as the house settled into the stillness of sleep, a piercing strangled cry shattered the calm. It came from the east wing, from the very room where the portrait had been displayed. Felix Carter was discovered unconscious, blood staining his collar, a shallow gash on his forehead. The portrait, once haunting, now defaced, had suffered a deliberate slash that ran diagonally across the face of the woman, cutting through her features with surgical precision. The room showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen, but the violence wrought upon the painting was a clear message. Miss Marple's mind raced as she examined the scene. The blood, the strange precision of the cut. It wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was a warning, a silent plea from someone who had seen too much. Felix, when he regained consciousness, remembered only fragments, a shadow, a hand, and the overpowering scent of lavender. Something about the entire scene felt off, as though they were being led towards a conclusion they weren't ready to accept. The following morning, the news spread like wildfire. Felix Carter, the man who had named the portrait, had been found dead. The scene was eerily quiet, the door locked from within, the windows sealed, and no visible wound or cause of death. It was Charlotte who discovered him, knocking on the door with no answer, only to find it stubbornly locked. When the door was finally forced open, Felix was discovered slumped in the chair, his body still, a glass of half-drunk liquid beside him, his face pale and serene. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious injuries, nothing but the stillness of death that hung heavy in the room. Miss Marple, as always, saw through the facade. A death of intention, not of chance, she murmured softly. The constables arrived quickly, but their investigation only raised more questions than answers. The room told a story of quiet deliberation, of something far more deliberate than a simple accident or natural death. Felix's death, like the slashing of the portrait, was an act of control, a message to those who had begun to unravel a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Miss Marple's mind whirred with new possibilities, as she pieced together the fragments of what had occurred. The portrait was not merely a work of art, it was a key to a much older mystery, one woven into the very fabric of Langford itself. As the village waited in fearful anticipation, Miss Marple knew that the truth, however painful, would eventually come to light, but it would not come without cost, and perhaps, just perhaps, that cost would be far greater than anyone had anticipated. The village constabulary, seasoned in matters of trivial theft and the occasional domestic squabble, found itself woefully underprepared for the gravity of Felix Carter's death. They had never dealt with something as chillingly calculated as poisoning, let alone one that implicated a man of standing, a visitor from beyond their quiet borders. The preliminary report from Dr. Webb confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Felix had been poisoned, not in the dramatic flourish of a traditional mystery, but with a cold, methodical precision that spoke of a sinister intent. Traces of hemlock, that ancient and quiet killer, had been discovered. Once favored by philosophers in their more contemplative moments, it had now become the weapon of choice for those who preferred silence to spectacle, leaving no theatrical display of suffering, but a quiet and assured end. What intrigued Miss Marple further, however, was the fact that the door to the painting room had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no items missing, save for the glass that had contained the poison. A glass, now empty, had been left behind, a subtle yet unmistakable marker of the crime, a life snuffed out with the same cold precision as a stroke of paint on a canvas. The room, once home to forgotten artworks, had transformed into something far darker. It had become the site of a quiet war, one waged in shadows, where the truth was determined to remain buried at all costs. As Miss Marple studied the lifeless body of the art dealer, she didn't just ask herself who had wanted him dead. She asked what it was that Felix Carter had so nearly uncovered. Inspector Cray arrived by midday, his reputation preceding him like the firm tread of a man who had learned the art of command during his years serving under the late Colonel Langford. His clipped speech, his demeanor of quiet competence, and the reverence he held for his old commanding officer, marked him as a man of principle. However, as Miss Marple noted quietly to Ruth, discretion could be as much a weakness as it was a virtue, depending on what it chose to obscure. Cray took immediate charge of the investigation, sealing the room and questioning the household. The glass from which Felix had drunk was removed for further analysis. Yet, despite his thoroughness, one detail evaded him: the bottle containing the poison had vanished without a trace. If Felix had ingested hemlock, the vessel that carried it should have remained, but no such container, vial or decanter could be found. Only the glass, a notebook, and a blotting pad lay in the room, their presence as banal as any other office space, save for the ominous absence of the poison's vessel. Charlotte confirmed that Felix had brought no refreshments of his own, and Mrs. Vane, the housekeeper, denied sending anything up to the room. Yet the poison had been consumed, administered and ingested without leaving a single trace. Miss Marple said little, as the inspector conducted his round of questioning, her gaze flickering over each person with the practiced eye of someone who knew that the smallest detail often carried the weight of an entire story. What fascinated her was not the questions Cray asked, but the way he asked them. He was meticulous, yes, but there was a subtle restraint in his tone, a deliberate avoidance of any inquiry that might cast suspicion upon Colonel Langford's memory. The loyalty Cray held toward his former commander was evident, but Miss Marple, ever astute, recognized it as both a virtue and a potential flaw, perhaps even the key to the locked room mystery before her. As Cray compiled a list of those with access to Langford Manor's East Wing, it quickly became clear that the circle of potential suspects was tightly controlled. There were only 5 people who held keys: Charlotte Langford, Mrs. Vane, a local carpenter hired for repairs, Mr. Goffrey the solicitor, and Lily Hayes, whose late husband had once been the groundskeeper, and who now assisted with odd household chores. None of them could account for their presence in the room the previous evening. The keys were accounted for, but the room had been locked from within. Felix Carter, alive just the day before, was now unmistakably dead. Miss Marple, having long since learned to trust her instincts over the superficial certainty of locked doors and official records, was not inclined to place her faith in the simple mechanics of keys and ledgers. She knew that houses, like people, revealed their secrets more through habit than hardware. It was during a quiet tea, the following day, that Miss Marple's sharp gaze fell upon Lily Hayes, seated across the room, her handkerchief clenched tightly in her lap. The embroidery, though subtle, caught Miss Marple's attention. It bore the marks of something more than mere decoration. The handkerchief, worn at the edges and frayed in places, seemed to carry a weight far beyond its mere fabric. Lily's movements were stiff, almost as though she was trying to suppress something, an emotion perhaps or a memory. It was in the way she clutched the handkerchief that Miss Marple saw the first flicker of truth. There was a tension in Lily's posture, a guardedness that spoke of a woman carrying a burden too heavy to be easily concealed. A moment later, Miss Marple noticed the subtle tremor in Lily's hand as it brushed against the fabric, an involuntary gesture that betrayed her otherwise composed exterior. The handkerchief, as unremarkable as it seemed, had become a symbol of something far more significant, an unspoken connection to the events unfolding around them. Miss Marple's mind, always sharp and calculating, turned over these small details with practiced precision. There was something in Lily's behavior, something in the way she held the handkerchief, that spoke volumes. But the mystery had not yet revealed its full complexity. As the investigation deepened and the stakes grew higher, Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much darker story, one that threatened to unravel not just the secrets of Langford Manor, but the carefully constructed facades of those who called it home. The evening wore on, and the village settled into an unnatural quiet after the unsettling discovery of Felix Carter's demise. As time passed, Miss Marple's mind churned with quiet determination, piecing together the fragments of this complex puzzle. A small, seemingly inconsequential detail lingered in her thoughts: the initials JL, which had surfaced in both the cryptic letter from Dorianville and now, curiously, in Lily Hayes' trembling hands. She had noted the way Lily clutched her handkerchief, the fabric twisted so tightly that the delicate embroidery almost seemed to disappear beneath the weight of her nervousness. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people, particularly those with secrets, betrayed themselves not through bold actions but through subtle gestures. Lily's quivering hand was not one of guilt, but of grief, a grief so deep, so tightly bound, that it bled through her every action. Grief, Miss Marple knew, often accompanied secrets, especially the kind that could never be spoken aloud. The village, still reeling from the shock of Felix's death, was slowly starting to unravel long-suppressed stories. The whispers grew louder as old memories resurfaced, memories of a young woman, an enigma wrapped in the shroud of war. Some said she had been a visitor, a fleeting figure at Langford Manor during the war. Others suggested she had been far more than that, someone with a deeper connection to the house and its inhabitants. Mrs. Tartan, the milliner's sister, recalled seeing a young woman wearing a French scarf, walking along the southern orchard path late one evening. It was odd, she said, especially considering the hour and the company the colonel usually kept. The Reverend's housemaid spoke of a parcel addressed to J.L. that had been redirected urgently, but like the others, she could not recall the significance of the initials. Only one thing was certain. The young woman had appeared from nowhere, and vanished just as mysteriously. The village, it seemed, had erased her from its collective memory. And yet, Miss Marple was not fooled by the village's gentle repression. As the stories trickled in, each fragment adding to the larger puzzle, Miss Marple began to see the woman not as a missing person, but as a ghost. Someone who had been loved, hidden, and ultimately silenced. And now, in Felix's death, it seemed the truth of her existence was beginning to resurface, albeit with deadly consequences. Miss Marple's quiet inquiries soon revealed more than expected, as the villagers spoke without thinking, dropping clues like breadcrumbs. The retired schoolmistress, with a faraway look in her eyes, mentioned a young woman who had listened more than she had spoken during the war. Mrs. Vane, when questioned about the colonel's wartime correspondence, hesitated just long enough before admitting that it had all been destroyed. It was the parish records, however, that yielded the breakthrough. There in faded ink was the name Jean Laurent, listed as a temporary guest at Langford Manor during the war, with no further remarks, no departure date, just an arrow, pointing forward in time. The initials matched the letter, the face in the painting, and the silence that had enveloped her life. Jean Laurent had been swallowed by the war, her existence erased by the very people who had once hidden her away. She had been a foreigner, a woman with no family, no allies, and no future. And yet, in the quiet corridors of Langford Manor, her memory had been preserved in a painting, an unspoken testament to a past long buried. Miss Marple knew that names were not always answers. Sometimes, they were keys. And this key, she was certain, would unlock a truth far darker than any of them had anticipated. The war had not just erased Jean Laurent's life, it had condemned her to silence. And now, it seemed, the same silence had claimed Felix Carter as its victim. Miss Marple closed the book gently, allowing the weight of her discovery to settle around her. There was more to this story than anyone had yet realized. The truth, she was certain, was far from over, and the people of Langford Manor had far more to hide than they were willing to admit. Beneath Langford's silent gaze, hidden in the folds of the earth, lay a secret rooted deeper than mere soil. The rosebush, inconspicuous and unremarkable to the eye, held a singular devotion from Colonel Thorne, a man whose affection for anything living was sparse, yet there it stood, a peculiar testament to something far beyond the ordinary. It was planted one cold, fog-laden morning, in the shadow of war, and for reasons unspoken, it became a fixture in the garden, a memorial without name, a monument to an absence that no one dared address. The gardener, Mr. Barnes, had been entrusted with its care, yet when asked about it, his voice faltered with the weight of something unacknowledged, something too uncomfortable to name. He had not planted the bush, the colonel himself had done so, his hands carefully cradling the delicate roots as though to bury something far more precious than the plant itself. When Miss Marple, with her patient, watchful nature, inquired about the bush, she was met with the veneer of casual indifference, a harmless curiosity about garden practices. But in truth, it was more than an innocuous question. It was an opening, a crack in the surface that beckoned the truth to rise. The gardener's silence spoke volumes, and Miss Marple, never one to rush, let the pieces settle in her mind. The bush became her focus, a symbol of something buried, and not just beneath the soil. The evening light cast a haunting glow as she stood before it, lost in her thoughts, wondering what the earth concealed and why it had been buried with such care. It was not just a plant, it was a cipher, a marker of something lost, something that could never be spoken aloud. The following days saw Miss Marple's quiet persistence at work, her inquiries, gentle and indirect, weaving a tapestry of unspoken truths. There were hints, whispers about the Colonel's personal fondness for foreign jams, idle recollections of a French woman, mysterious and fleeting, and stories of a child, whose existence had been erased from memory, as if to deny it had ever been. As the web of suspicion tightened, Charlotte, under Miss Marple's guidance, sought to unearth the secrets that the Colonel had so carefully buried. It was not the rosebush that held the answer, but what lay beneath it, silently, persistently waiting to be found. When the earth finally yielded its secret, it was not a box, nor a letter, but a tarnished silver locket, bound by a decayed ribbon. The photograph inside was faded, but unmistakable, the woman from the portrait, holding a child, her child. The initials JL were etched into the locket's interior, a final, unspoken testament to a love hidden from the world, a child whose name had been erased, whose existence had been buried along with its mother. Miss Marple's fingers traced the cold metal, and though no words passed her lips, her mind raced with the implications. This was not a mere puzzle, this was a conspiracy of silence, a deliberate act to erase a woman from history, a child from the village's memory. And yet, the presence of the locket, buried beneath the rosebush, suggested something far darker than an attempt to forget. It was an act of shame, one designed to ensure the truth was not only hidden, but destroyed. The second painting, long forgotten in the attic, revealed the final piece. Hidden behind a false panel in the Colonel's study, it was wrapped in cloth, carefully bound and left to gather dust. When it was uncovered, there was no mistaking it. The woman was there, once again, but this time, she cradled a child in her arms, the mother's desperate love for the child, so evident that the brushstrokes seemed to quiver with emotion. It was no coincidence. There had been a deliberate effort to erase the woman from the narrative, to silence the child, to bury the truth beneath layers of deception. The Colonel had not only hidden a person but an entire story, one of love, loss, and a future denied. And now, as the shadows of the past began to lift, Miss Marple understood, this was not just a case of a missing woman. It was a story of a life that had been forcibly erased, a child's existence condemned to silence, and a truth buried so deeply that even time had not dared to unearth it. The web was unraveling, and the threads of the past were pulling taut, revealing a truth more dangerous than anyone had dared to imagine. Beneath the fading light of the afternoon, the garden at Langford Manor held a secret as old as the ivy that wound through its stone walls. The rosebush, planted with such deliberate care, had once stood as an unassuming element of the estate, yet its roots reached far deeper than the soil could reveal. It was the Colonel's private monument, its petals unremarkable, its fragrance faint, but to those who knew, it held the weight of a history buried beneath layers of silence. Miss Marple, with her quiet attentiveness, had long suspected the true nature of its presence. Her inquiries, framed as mere curiosity about the garden's care, elicited the confession from Mr. Barnes, the gardener, who trembled as he revealed that the bush had been placed not by him, but by the Colonel himself, one crisp autumn morning near the war's end. It had arrived, he whispered, in a simple wooden crate, with no fanfare, no ceremony, just a quiet act of devotion. But what had it marked? Miss Marple, ever the perceptive observer, had asked for a moment with the bush, for it was more than a simple plant, it was a marker, an enduring memorial, that carried with it a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Under the guise of historical research, she arranged for it to be unearthed, and what emerged from the soil was not a letter or a relic, but a tarnished locket, its delicate ribbon decayed with time. Inside, a faded photograph of a woman, Jean Laurent, and a child, their identities obscured by time, but unmistakable in their connection. The locket bore no surname, only the initials, JL, etched in silver, that seemed to hold an eternal weight of secrecy. This was no ordinary family heirloom. It was the key to a past that had been deliberately erased. Miss Marple's mind raced as she traced the thread of this forgotten woman and her child, knowing full well that their existence had been hidden for a reason, far darker than mere shame. It was no accident that Joan Laurent's name had disappeared from the village, nor that her child had been erased from history. The first portrait of Joan had been painted with the gentleness of a mother, but the second, a hidden masterpiece, revealed behind a false panel, spoke volumes. In that portrait, Joan held the child close, cradling the weight of something precious, something threatened by the world's judgment. It was a portrait not of love, but of survival. The child, now long vanished from the face of the earth, was not just a secret. They were a symbol of an inheritance no one wanted to claim. The questions Miss Marple posed were no longer about the woman who had vanished, but about the child. What had become of them? And why had their mere existence threatened to unravel everything? Charlotte, ever unaware of the weight she carried in her own veins, stumbled upon a letter written by her grandfather, its contents simple but haunting. "We do not choose the children life gives us, but we bear the weight of them nonetheless." It was a letter forgotten in a drawer, but it stirred something deep within Charlotte, an unsettling thought that perhaps her own heritage had been born not in scandal, but in something far more complex. Was she truly the legitimate heir she believed herself to be, or was she the product of a secret, born of a love, long buried, and a shameful truth never spoken? The portrait of Joan Laurent, now twisted with this new understanding, reflected a truth far more painful than the canvas itself had ever intended to reveal. And Miss Marple, ever patient and attuned to the silences that spoke louder than words, knew that the past had come alive once again. In villages like Langford, where respectability was everything and secrets could not be allowed to fester, this revelation would not be tolerated. Old resentments would resurface, and the ones who had once lived under the illusion of untouchable respectability would find their own reputations at risk. Miss Marple had known from the start that Felix Carter's death was not a random act. It had been tied to something far greater, a secret so deeply rooted that it could no longer be buried without consequences. As she sat beside Lily Hayes, who carried the burden of knowledge too dangerous to speak, the final pieces began to fall into place. Lily had been a witness, though she had never told anyone what she had seen. The anger, the fear, the woman who had stood her ground despite the Colonel's rage. And then she had vanished, just as silently as she had come. But Lily had seen the truth that day, a truth that would not be buried forever. The question now was whether it could be contained, or whether the weight of it would crush everyone it touched. The garden stood untouched, a silent witness to memories too painful to speak of, yet too haunting to forget. The whispers of Joan Laurent's past had faded, only to rise again, sharper, more dangerous. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the portrait, no longer just a piece of art, but a map of secrets buried deep beneath Langford Manor's stoic walls. The soft, blurred features of Joan, her expression tender yet sorrowful, held a truth, undeniable, but untold, that only a few could decipher. The locket that adorned her neck gleamed like an unspoken promise, its silent weight more potent than words. Charlotte's thoughts swirled as she recalled the mysterious letter hidden away in a forgotten drawer. Her grandfather's handwriting had once seemed a relic, an heirloom of family lore, but now it felt like a warning. The letter's few words about children, those we do not choose but are bound to by fate, seemed to cut through the years, pulling her to a truth she had long avoided. Her father's past was not what she had imagined. He was not a man born of a brief foreign marriage, but something darker, more clandestine, a product of secrets woven in the shadows. The portrait, once enigmatic, now stood as a symbol of the weight of this secret, the child's identity forever linked to a mother erased from memory. It was no longer about who Joan Laurent had been, but who her child had become, and why that truth had remained hidden for so long. Charlotte's every glance in the mirror, became a question she could not answer, as the features of her own face, so like the child in the portrait, haunted her. Miss Marple, ever watchful, sensed the shift in Charlotte, the silent turmoil that had begun to surface. Langford, with its quiet village life and its tightly held traditions, had never allowed for such revelations. Respectability, carefully curated like the hedges that lined the manor's grounds, was a fragile thing. The idea of an illegitimate heir, a child born in secrecy, threatened everything. But Miss Marple understood that secrets buried too deep could fester, and if Felix Carter had stumbled too close to unearthing that truth, his death was no accident. It was a warning, a desperate act to protect the past. Lily Hayes, once a girl of 16, had witnessed something that day in the garden, something she had never spoken of, but had never truly forgotten. Jean, standing tall and unyielding, had been more than just a woman in distress. She had been a mother, fighting to protect a child, whose very existence had been a threat. And when Jean had disappeared, so too had the child, taken, erased, as if neither had ever been. But the garden, the house, the silence, they remembered. It was in this silence that the truth had found its hiding place. Miss Marple knew how quickly fear could masquerade as concern, how easily a lie could be dressed in the righteousness of morality. She could almost hear Mrs. Blatchford's carefully constructed rumors, whispers of espionage and betrayal, designed not to explain, but to justify. The lies surrounding Jean's disappearance had been crafted to protect, to erase, to bury a truth that might unravel everything. And now, in the dim light of the manor, that truth was beginning to surface. Mrs. Vane, a woman who had once kept the house in order, now quietly unraveled the threads of her own complicity, revealing the final damning piece of the puzzle. The child had survived. But Jean, broken by the weight of it all, had not. The silence that followed her death had been absolute, the house a mausoleum to the secrets it held. And Felix Carter, in his quiet persistent inquiries, had come dangerously close to uncovering what the world had refused to acknowledge. It was not the portrait that had sealed his fate, but the truth he had begun to unearth, a truth that had cost him his life. The portrait, the child, the locket, each had been a piece of the puzzle, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally ask the question that would expose it all. But questions once asked had a way of leading to answers that were far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. On a dusky Thursday, as the village lulled into its familiar rhythm of lowered guard and quiet routines, Eleanor Bainbridge, neither young nor easily swayed by sentiment, summoned those whose lives still trembled under the shadow of a secret buried decades ago. No formal letters were sent, only delicate urgings, passed through whispers, chance encounters at the post office, or over rhubarb jam at the market. And so they came reluctantly, as if drawn by the gravity of something left undone. Margaret Tilling, whose hands had not stopped trembling since the inquest. Old Mr. Hawthorne, once the church's record keeper, now a man of silences and shadows. Young Celia Reed, who remembered nothing but carried a face like a ghost from another time. And finally, Reverend Paulson, whose sermons had lately turned to fire and repentance. Eleanor sat not as a judge, but as a quiet reckoner, her voice as soft as falling ash as she recounted a tale, long excised from official memory. A tale of a young girl who arrived during the war, not as a guest but as a transaction, and who vanished not with a goodbye, but with the suddenness of erased ink. It wasn't condemnation Eleanor sought, but revelation, unearthing details, as if sweeping away the dust on a mirror's surface. How the girl's child was delivered in secret by unskilled hands. How she died while the others debated what story would least disturb their reputations. How the infant, whisked away and unnamed, had survived, placed not in a home but in a lineage of lies, baptized under an assumed name that never reached the parish's ledgers. The silence that followed Eleanor's telling was not mere discomfort. It was the hush of recognition, a collective inhalation before the storm of truth. The poison that had taken Edwin Blackwell, local historian and amateur archivist, had been administered with a trembling conviction not rooted in cruelty, but in fear. He had uncovered a transfer deed, dated 1 week after the girl's death, listing a child's guardianship not in legalese, but coded benevolence. It had been enough. Eleanor recalled how Mrs. Tilling had insisted on bringing tea that evening, a rare breach of her disdain for domestic duties, and how she pressed Edwin to drink, her voice nearly a plea masked as concern. The room grew dense, as if the weight of unspoken years now gathered at the crown of every bowed head. And when Eleanor finally named the child, Celia, there was no outcry, no denial, just a long, aching silence that wrapped itself around the truth like ivy on stone. It had not been malice that erased the girl from history, but the village's relentless obsession with cleanliness, not of floors or windows, but of conscience. And in the end, it was not Eleanor's accusation that unraveled them, but their own memories, which once stirred, refused to return to sleep. On a dusk-draped Thursday in the village of Elmsbridge, where ivy clung like memory to stone, and the air forever tasted of distant whispers, the vicarage bell tolled once, not for ceremony, but for consequence. No formal summons had been sent, no letter sealed in wax, yet those who mattered found themselves drawn, as though the past itself had tugged at their sleeves. The drawing-room of the Weatherby estate, seldom used and thick with the scent of lavender and mothballs, bore witness to a gathering not of guests but of keepers of an unraveling truth. At the room's heart stood Miss Edelyn Thorncroft, neither accuser nor advocate, but an observer who had watched shadows flicker too long to ignore. Her voice, when it came, was like the soft crackle of burning paper, low, deliberate, patient. She spoke not of crimes, but of the decay of silence, of the rot that formed when secrets were buried under praise and ritual. She began with the Halworths, a family embroidered into the fabric of Elmsbridge life, respected, immovable, and fiercely curated in memory. But there had been a girl once, not listed in their family tree, but stitched in somewhere deeper, a ward they had said, though no official guardianship existed. Her name was Annalise Brown, a refugee from Vienna, brought during the war under the veil of mercy. She had come with nothing but a silver locket, and eyes too old for 16. Her presence, tolerated at first, became a whisper, then a problem. A child had been born in secrecy, and disappeared just as quietly. Rumors tangled like ivy, but no one dared cut too deep. Then years later, as the village busied itself with maypole preparations and spring fairs, Felix Whittier returned, a war historian, curious by profession and restless by nature. He took an interest not in legends, but in parish footnotes. He asked questions too many. He lingered in the church archives, spoke to those who remembered what others had tried to forget. It was Mrs. Halworth who invited him for tea on the night he died, though she claimed it was her daughter who laid the table. Miss Thorncroft noted, with the precision of a woman who had raised 5 cats and trusted none, that Mrs. Halworth had never before served guests herself, nor cared for the arrangements of a tea tray. And yet on that evening, she had personally prepared it, even insisting Felix try a particular herbal concoction. For the nerves, she said, though it was no herb the garden had grown in decades. As Edelyn recounted these details, she did not accuse, she simply allowed the facts to arrange themselves, like jigsaw pieces fallen quietly into place. No one interrupted. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed reluctant to intrude. She spoke of propriety as a veil, of kindness used as a blade. She spoke of a woman who had confused virtue with victory, who had chosen the neatness of silence over the chaos of truth. And when Edelyn repeated, with unsettling calm, the phrase she'd overheard in the greengrocer's some weeks prior, "That girl never belonged here. Not truly, not after what she did," she looked not at the accused, but at the empty chair where Felix might have sat. The room held its breath, and then, like old wood groaning under weight, Mrs. Halworth began to cry, not in bursts, but in a slow unspooling grief. She confessed nothing outright, yet in her fractured phrases, in the tremble of her hands as she clutched a handkerchief too tightly, the shape of guilt emerged. She had not intended death, only retreat, only silence, but the poison kept since the war in a locked drawer meant for medicines long discarded, had been her final act of preservation. Felix had known too much, asked too well, and she, believing herself the steward of the family's legacy, had decided what truth the soil of Elmsbridge could bear. Inspector Harrow, present and grim, stood only when the air could no longer carry the weight. He made no dramatic arrests, only the gentle notation of tragedy in his ledger. In the weeks that followed, changes came like the slow lifting of fog. The Weatherby estate opened its long-closed west wing for an exhibit titled Echoes and Silences, Lost Voices of Elmsbridge. There were no grand banners, only quiet curation, a faded photograph, a silver locket, a baptism record amended by trembling hands. Some villagers came in disbelief, others stayed in stillness before the image of a girl no one had dared remember properly. Miss Thorncroft never spoke of the gathering again. When asked, she merely said, "Sometimes the dead need witnesses, not for justice, for truth." And in the manor garden, where a certain rosebush bloomed unnaturally late that year, a plaque now read, "Annalise Bran, 1926, 1943, beloved, belonging." Beneath the flickering amber light of Hollowmere Hall's oldest chandelier, now restored after decades of dust and silence, a new portrait hung, not of aristocrats or war heroes, but of a woman once erased from both memory and record. It was titled simply, Celeste Duval, Witness, Survivor, Keeper of the Forgotten, placed by Amelia Thorne, great niece of the late matriarch, and reluctant heir to the estate. The decision was not one of rebellion, but reckoning. The village of Bleakridge, perched on the edge of fog and folklore, had whispered about Celeste for years. A foreign accent heard in church once, a child seen briefly near the edge of the orchard, a fire that had just happened in the west wing, never fully spoken of. But truth, as Miss Elspeth Morrow, the retired historian and friend to Amelia, had once remarked, does not decay quietly. It surfaces, persistent as ivy. It had started with a letter, discovered wedged behind the panel of a moth-eaten armchair, addressed in curling script to a beloved L, and signed CD. Its contents hinted not at scandal, but at shelter, of a wartime promise made by the previous lord of the manor, one that turned the ancestral house into a sanctuary for a woman, hunted not by soldiers, but by silence. Digging followed, first in drawers, then archives, then attics sealed with rusted latches. Sketches emerged, delicate, haunting, of faces unknown, and rooms once repurposed for hiding rather than hosting. A journal was found, its pages brittle but ink vivid with grief and guarded hope. Piece by reluctant piece, Amelia stitched together a story long unwelcome in family lore. Celeste had not been a passing refugee, but a witness to an atrocity covered by privilege and power. Her silence had been bought with promises, her presence rewritten, until even her child, later adopted into the village, without surname or truth, had never known the name of the woman who once sang him lullabies behind locked shutters. What followed was not a scandal, but a reckoning. The drawing room, once lined with muskets and oil portraits of generals, now held exhibits of letters, sketches, and court transcripts, each framed with care. The villagers came at first with narrowed eyes, but stayed with widened hearts, reading not just about Celeste, but about what had been done to keep her story hidden. Tea was served by Amelia herself on Saturdays, lemon verbena, Celeste's favorite. The hearth now bore her likeness, eyes sharp yet kind, a quiet storm of endurance etched in each brushstroke. Miss Morrow stood beside it one morning, touching the frame like a benediction, whispering that sometimes justice wasn't about punishment, but presence, about giving memory a home, where once there had only been forgetting. In that room, time folded, villagers who had once muttered now lingered, children who had never heard her name now asked about the lady with the strong eyes, and above it all, the portrait watched, not haunting, but holding space. Amelia no longer feared the legacy of Hollowmere. The truth had not destroyed it. It had redeemed it, and as twilight bled through the stained glass windows, Miss Morrow sat by the fire, knitting in silence, not out of grief, but in peace. For some stories, once unearthed, do not scream, they breathe. In the west wing of Elmridge House, once sealed, once spoken of only in unfinished sentences, Amelia Renshaw unveiled a canvas wrapped in aged linen, and marked with a date, no one had dared to trace. The dust rose as she unwrapped it, the silence in the room stretching taut as the eyes of the figure in the painting emerged from shadow. A woman with wind-tossed hair, one hand resting on an open book, the other clutching something almost imperceptible. A child's shoe perhaps, or a letter. No plaque identified her. No records bore her name. But Amelia, the last in a line of Renshaws, who had walked past this bricked-up chamber without daring to question why, felt the weight of the omission like an old guilt resurfacing. That evening, the house shifted, not in structure, but in memory. In the candlelight, Amelia traced the worn edges of letters found beneath a false floorboard, half-burnt confessions, torn photographs, and journal entries written in the slanted, hurried hand of someone desperate to preserve a truth the house had long buried. They spoke of a woman, Margot Deverell, once declared unfit, then erased, not by time, but by those who feared the truth she carried. She had not been mad, as the family claimed, but in love, with the wrong man in the wrong year, during the wrong war. Amelia read until dawn, each word unspooling like thread through generations of silence. The next day, with trembling hands, she placed the portrait in the library, above the hearth where once hung the patriarch's oil likeness, he of medals, cold eyes, and a judgment that still echoed in corridors. Villagers came not for the portrait at first, but for the open garden, curious about the odd announcement of an archival opening. They stayed, however, drawn into the story whispered between teacups and beneath ivy-draped trellises. Some remembered Margot as a governess, who vanished. Others had never heard her name. But all who gazed upon the painting felt something unspoken tighten in their chest. It wasn't the mystery that kept them. It was the realization that truth, once exhumed, had a strange, quiet gravity. Miss Lillian Dare, who had taught at the parish school, and never missed morning mass, lingered longest. She didn't speak. She simply looked. And later, when Amelia asked why she returned the next day and the day after, Lillian only said, because she waited long enough. By summer, the house no longer echoed with silence, but with low voices, shared recollections, and sometimes, laughter. The east wing remained closed, but it no longer loomed with the weight of what had been hidden. Instead, Elmridge became a place of slow forgiveness. One afternoon, Amelia stood beside the portrait and whispered, "You are seen now." And though the brushstrokes remained unchanged, the woman's expression seemed to soften just slightly, as if time itself had drawn closer to listen. The past, once buried in bricked walls and family shame, had risen not to accuse, but to breathe. And in that breath, a story long denied, found its place in the light. Years had passed since anyone dared speak the name, Isolde Hartright, within the ivy-wrapped boundaries of Merrow Hollow, a village where time stood still and whispers traveled faster than facts. Yet in the creaking loft of an abandoned carriage house, where the dust lay so thick it hushed every step, Anna Trevors discovered a painting, tall, haunting, and half buried beneath mouldy canvas and brittle newsprint from 1912. The woman depicted looked directly out from the oil-darkened fabric, with an expression not of pride but of defiance. One hand curled into a fist, the other resting against her heart as though bracing for a verdict that never came. No one had told Anna about Isolde, though the townspeople spoke in reverent tones of the Hartright name. They remembered the estate, the scandals, the fire that had supposedly taken everything, but they never mentioned a sister, nor that one had disappeared so completely, that even the family Bible listed her name as only I.H. Anna, knew instantly what she'd found wasn't just a painting. It was an accusation, a plea for truth, preserved beneath decades of silence. The town archives yielded little. The church registers were altered, and the few elders still living offered only tight-lipped warnings. Some stories, they muttered, are better left in the dark. But Anna, with a mind sharpened by solitude, and a will fortified by loss, pressed forward. In the cellar of the rectory, she unearthed letters smuggled between servants, cryptic and fearful, references to Isolde's condition, her reckless passions, her need for removal. A single sentence chilled her. She saw too much, said too much, loved too wrongly. The implication was not just that Isolde had been silenced, but erased. Restoring the painting wasn't enough. Anna framed it and placed it in her bookstore window where all could see it. The eyes that once stared out from dust now met the world again, unflinching. The townspeople reacted as expected. Gasps, gossip, denial. But gradually, the resistance softened into curiosity, and curiosity into reckoning. Isolde became a name again, not a whisper. Elderly Mrs. Wexley brought a diary she'd hidden for decades. Mr. Avery recalled a poem once recited in secret by a governess, who vanished in the same year. Slowly, the fragments of Isolde's life pieced themselves into something whole, not a scandal, but a story of bravery and betrayal, of a woman too honest for her time. Anna, sitting beneath the now cleaned skylight of the old carriage house, reflected on what it meant to dig through silence. The truth, she mused, is a fragile thing, bruised by shame, buried by fear, but resilient. Once given air, it blooms, not with fury but with clarity. Justice, she realized, doesn't always wear a judge's robes. Sometimes, it arrives in the hands of a woman with a paintbrush, a photograph, or a stubborn heart. So now, dear listener, if you had found the portrait of Isolde Hartright, knowing the storm it would stir, would you have exposed it to the light, or kept it hidden in the dark comfort of secrecy? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think, and your reflections breathe life into stories like this. If you crave more mysteries born of silence, secrets, and human truths buried just beneath the surface, be sure to subscribe and share this tale with those who believe in justice written not in courtrooms, but in memory. Until next time, stay brave, stay curious, and never fear the truth that waits in the quiet.